Welcome back to another video, and this week we are talking about Columbine. And Columbine is a sensitive topic, so viewer discretion and listener discretion is advised. I want to say I will handle the massacre itself with kid gloves. I'm not going to be disrespectful to the victims. I'm not going to, try to make some edgy jokes about a school shooting that killed multiple children. However, when it's come to Eric and Dylan, I will not be kind to them. They do not deserve kindness. They deserve to rot where they are. And we're going to get into that. But nonetheless, let's talk about Columbine. Columbine took place April 20th, 1999, and Columbine was not the first school shooting. But I think most people believe it is because they were born after it happened, or it was one that we hear about the most. Columbine was the most theatrical, most publicized, because it was really an attack on American society at the time. Now, Columbine, the high school, was a hot spot for bullying, but Littleton, Colorado was a very peaceful place. Nothing ever really happened there. So the idea that something crazy like this happened in a peaceful, calm community is really what shook the foundation of what we know as the template, the blueprint, the playbook of a school shooting. So I want to say Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not bullied outcasts. They weren't unrecognized geniuses. These were two bastards that found each other. One was a depressive, one was a sociopath, a psychopath, and they just fed on each other's insecurities and their own egos. So let's not feel sorry for them at all. The idea that they were both really bullied and downtrodden students that snapped, that didn't happen. This was a carefully orchestrated and thought out plan that they had thought out for, I think, at least a year. So let's get that out of the way before we get into this whole story. Let's talk about Eric Harris in a vacuum. Just psychologically, cold, somewhat calculating. He had an insane God complex. Just as a senior in high school, he was looking up to Hitler, and he had this weird superiority complex. And if you look at Eric Harris, you don't know why he feels so superior to everybody else, but he had a strong superiority complex. Also, when covering this, I will say, listener discretion advised. Whenever I'm reading something they say, and this goes for any of my videos, I do like to quote them directly. So if I say something and you're like, wow, I can't believe he said that, that's offensive, or wow, I didn't want to hear that word or that curse word, I apologize. But in fairness of just being completely transparent here, I'm just going to read what they said so you get the full grasp of who they are. So with Eric, like I said, he had this God complex, and he said, and like, well, I'm reading it right here. He said, I will be God. If you shitheads had any brains, you get out while you had a chance. Now, that was in his journal. Now, let's talk about Dylan, because Dylan is the opposite here. Dylan is a lost, angry, depressed, suicidal individual. He said, which is interesting that they have this parallel, but this is in Dylan's private journal. He says, me is a god of sadness. I see the truth. I am this truth. He was drowning in so much self-hatred. Like, this guy was just pathetic. I think pathetic is the correct term. He was absolutely pathetic, yet he wasn't, don't get it twisted, he's not the victim here. But he was pathetic, he was an alcoholic, he was a depressive. And I'm not saying to be depressed makes you pathetic, but when you are writing in your journal that you are the god of sadness, you are pathetic. And just a bit of a PSA, okay? This is going to sound harsh, but if you're in Dylan Klebold's shoes and you're not going to get the help, because he didn't want the help, he just wanted to die, and he had this idea that if I'm going to die, I'm going to take everyone with you. You don't have to do that, okay? Coming from someone who has attempted suicide before, who has had very depressive moments and just different things in my life, I can say that taking everyone out with you is probably the most selfish and asinine thing you can do. And if Dylan had just taken himself out and not decided to participate in this massacre, I believe the world would be a better place for it. That being said, let's get into the dynamic that these two have. Let's talk about the basement tapes. Just real quick, no, just gloss over the basement tapes. The basement tapes are just both of them in the basement talking about this massacre. Like, they're calm, they're smiling, they're laughing, they're having a good old time. And I quote, Eric says this, "You'll all be sorry when you hear about us in the news." Yeah, there is no remorse in these. It's just a bunch of entitlement and rage. And really, the sad thing about the dynamic between Eric and Dylan is Dylan may have made it out alive. If he would have sought treatment, if he would have gotten away from Eric and wasn't so like destined to impress this loser, because that's exactly what Eric was. Not in a popularity sense, but personally, he was a loser. If he wasn't so set on impressing him, Dylan could have got help. Dylan could have made it out of this alive, but unfortunately, at this point, it was just too late for him. Let's talk about the big misconception here as well. While we're on the topic of these two guys, they weren't bullied, okay? They weren't the victims here. They weren't the bottom of the totem pole. They had friends. They played sports. They went to prom. They were decently popular. For 1999 high school, they were pretty popular. They were not the victims. They didn't just snap. This wasn't a jocks versus the nerds situation. They coldly and calculatedly planned this out for over a year. So once again, let's not find sympathy. Let's not martyr two dickheads who made horrible decisions. They didn't want to just kill. They wanted to perform it. They wanted a grandiose act. They wanted to be known amongst, the legion of names of just horrible individuals. They wanted to be there. Sure, I have this written down. Eric fit the mold of a clinical psychopath, charming, manipulative, which sounds a lot like Ted Bundy. And honestly, if he hadn't done what he did, he probably would have ended up like someone like Ted Bundy. Charming, manipulative, lacking empathy. Dylan, however, showed signs of a major depressive, suicidal ideation, identity confusion, and together they created a closed system, one that rewarded violence and punished doubt. If I were to give, because I gave Ted Bundy is the superlative, he is the comparison of someone like Eric Harris, I would see someone, Dylan, almost as just like a whiny man, like a whiny killer, depressive, doesn't know why he feels the way he feels, acts out. Someone like Dahmer, someone who just is so down on themselves and drowning themselves in alcohol every single night with these dark urges that he has. That brings us to the plan here. So they didn't just walk into their school. They didn't waltz in here with guns just willy-nilly. No, they had these homemade bombs and homemade pipe bombs, and they had a plan. And their original plan was they were going to blow up the school, and they're going to kill tons of people. They're going to blow up these beams. School's going to collapse, cafeteria, library, and it's going to kill all these students. And then as they flee, they were going to sit in the parking lot and pick them off. They were going to shoot them as they walked out. So that gives you an idea of the plan. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for us, and decent human beings who think, they were almost as incompetent as they were violent. So that didn't go the way they thought it would. And that kind of leads us into the event of itself. You see, Eric and Dylan didn't just plan to shoot up their school. They planned a full massacre. Think about the Oklahoma City bombing. That's the scale that they wanted. And they wanted to go from the school and then go from home to home in the area, just killing people. That was their plan. I mean, Eric and Dylan wanted to kill hundreds of people. And if their plan had worked, honestly, they would have. I don't see them changing any aspect of what they wanted to do after the events of the high school massacre itself. So they built these bombs themselves, these two 20-pound propane tanks. They had wrapped nails around the tanks, created their own fuses, their own detonation system. Like I said, though, fortunately for everyone there that had survived, this didn't go well. Like, they were horrible bomb makers, like absolutely, like these failures, these walking failures. They were bad bomb makers. So since they weren't good at that, the death toll which would have been tripled, didn't happen, and they had to make their plan A quickly go into plan B, and that was to just go into the school with the guns and start the massacre. I'm sure you're thinking, how did they get the guns? You see, Mark Maines, he sold Eric a Tech 9 for $500, which if you really think about selling a high school student a Tech 9 for $500, like really just grasp that, it's insane. Robin Anderson bought them 3 guns at a gun show with no background check. So all legal, all easy, just another day in the USA, you know? So yeah, that's how they got their guns, and then they slowly collect a few here and there, and they get those trench coats going, and things start to go their way. So Harris had a High Point 995 carbine. Klebold had a Intratec Tech DC-9, 2 sawed-off 12-gauge shotguns, and 95 homemade explosives, which the 95 homemade explosive didn't end up working anyways. So they had enough firepower of a small SWAT team, and they went in there, just 2 suburban kids, no military background, no special training, Google, and time. That's all they had. Like, that's an extreme amount of evil and wickedness in their heart, soul, and mind, I guess. But this is where things kind of jump off. We're going to talk about the massacre, and if you see me look away, I do have my notes. I want to be very specific about what happened. I don't want to say anyone's name wrong. I don't want to devalue what has happened to the victims at all. So if you see me kind of look off, I'm just looking at my notes here. So April 20th, 1999, we already talked about this. This is the day that the massacre happens. The massacre starts at 11:19. It's just a Tuesday. It's a normal Tuesday for these students. And by 12:08 p.m., 13 people would be dead, 21 more injured, and 2 teenage boys would leave behind one of the darkest legacies in American history. So here's your minute-by-minute breakdown of the Columbine Massacre. By 11:10, the bombs were planted, and by 11:17, Eric and Dylan entered the school separately, each carrying duffel bags. Now inside, the propane bombs that were set to go off at 11:17. Nothing happens, however, so they walk outside, they stand by their cars, waiting for an explosion. Nothing happens, the bombs go off. No bombs go off, so they go for plan B, which was the guns. 11:19 at the west entrance, they open fire on students outside of the west entrance. Rachel Scott, 17, was killed instantly, and Richard Castaldo, who was eating lunch out in the grass with Rachel, was shot 8 times and was paralyzed. He ended up making the best recovery he could. This is the first blood of the event, and it was not the last. Eric and Dylan storm through the west doors. Gunfire echoes down the hall, and a teacher, Dave Sanders, rushes to evacuate the students. Dave Sanders, who was 48 years old, was a business teacher, and he was shot in the hallway. He ended up bleeding out, waiting for help. And this is something we don't really think about too often when it comes to Columbine, but it's the inactivity and the activity of the police department. Now, of course, nothing like this had really happened before in Littleton, Colorado. But at the same time, there was very inaction. They just kind of stood outside, very inactive during this. And we've seen this before. We've seen this recently in school shootings where the police weren't as active as you would think that they should be. Dave Sanders is a perfect example of just inactivity. He didn't die instantly. He ended up crawling into a science room, and students that were in that room were trying to keep him alive. And then he ended up dying from bleeding out just because he didn't get any help. The only people that were there were students to help him. So we move on here, 11 minutes. That's how long it took. They were in the library for 11 minutes after they made their move here. And I'm going to tell you all the 10 people that they murdered in the library. If the cafeteria was the original target, the ground zero, the library was probably the peak of this massacre. It was the worst. In 7 minutes, in about 7 minutes, 11 people, 10 people die. 10 students were murdered in 7 minutes in the library. So they entered the library. About 50 people were hiding in that library at their tables. Someone just called 911. A teacher, Patty Nelson, was hiding too. She had run in there after warning students down the hall. Eric shouts, "Get up," then fired his shotgun into the ceiling. And this is where the massacre really begins, because it's just, it's horrible. So they walked along the computer stations and they saw a 16-year-old Kyle Velasquez. Kyle didn't have time to react. He was shot in the head instantly. 16 years old. From there, they moved like hunters, table to table, firing, laughing, mocking people. The next victim, this is victim by victim here. Hiding underneath the table, shot in the head with a shotgun, Steve Curnow. And then Cassie was under a table when Eric approached her, Cassie Bernal. He asked if she believed in God. Contrary to the belief or the rumor that she, I do, yes, I do. She did not answer, and he just shot her in the head before she responded. She was 17. Isaac Scholes, 18, a black student and an athlete, was targeted. Eric shouted racial slurs at him before shooting him point blank. Dylan joined in laughing at them as well. I'm going through these people here and just really think. And like I said, I'm going to read these to you because I want you to understand that if you just take a breath and you think for a second after I say these names, that's probably about as much time they had to react before they lost their life. So when I go back to Isaiah, the reports where he got dragged from underneath a desk and shot. Matthew Kechter, 16, he was right next to Isaiah, killed while trying to hide. Lauren Townsend, 18, was hiding under a table with her friends. She was shot multiple times by Dylan. And they say a lot of the times, Eric wasn't saying anything. And Dylan was laughing and shooting and joking around and shooting random things and stuff. John Tomlin, 16, tried to crawl out from under a table. He was shot in the back and shot in the head. Kelly Fleming, 16, didn't make it under the table. Killed while lying on the floor. Daniel Mauser, 15, tried to fight back, pushed a chair into the shooters and was shot in the face. Corey DePuter was 17, killed last in the library. He was hiding on a table. He was calm, quiet, never stood a chance. And when you get to the taunting and the jokes that these dickheads, these asinine losers were making, they weren't killing people. They were trying to perform. They were saying things like peekaboo, and then when someone popped their head up, popped them in the head with a shotgun. Who's under there messing around? You in the white hat, let's see what you got, poking people with the shotgun. Everyone's going to be talking about us now. They threw pipe bombs at people. They mocked them. They injured them. The ones that didn't die and were just, hurt with buckshot that were crawling, they would laugh at them. 7 minutes it took, and 10 were dead. And the room was just soaked with blood and glass. And from there, they went to the halls and they were just shooting random stuff. Like, it's so empty. Everything they did was just empty. There was they had no purpose in this. No one wronged them. They just wanted to do it. It's insane. It really is. It's absolutely insane. This gets to my favorite part of the story, and it's when Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, they paint the library, they paint the computers and everything with their own interior thoughts. So if anyone was more deserving of having buckshot sent through their brain and have their eyes shoot through their head onto a computer screen, It was these two guys, and at a young age, I actually had seen these pictures of these two. Man, I just can't think of anything that I can say on camera that wouldn't make me lose my job or whatever. But these just two pieces of trash individuals, that they deserve more than what they did to themselves. I'm happy that their legacy in the long run ends in that room. It ends at Columbine High School. They don't get to leave, and they don't get to be interviewed, and they don't get to go to house and do all the things that they talked about. Um, they were cowards. They were losers. Um, Out of the students that I named, Dylan and Eric were the least deserving of any kind of sympathy, any kind of martyrdom, and any kind of life outside as a myth or a legend of Columbine High School. I think that's what pisses me off about this entire story, was the smoke hadn't cleared, the blood was still fresh, the bodies weren't even moved out of the school yet, and the blame game was still, like, it was already happening. It was never going to be Dylan and Eric. They were never going to be the ones who took the fall. There had to be something else. Something had to come over them. Something had to change them. It couldn't just be that these two dipshits were just extremely vile people. Let's talk about some of these fake headlines, some of these things that kind of popped up, and people use these to grab onto headlines and create these stories and narratives. So one is the trench coat mafia. Now the trench coat mafia. Eric and Dylan were not a part of the trench coat mafia. They weren't. The TCM, they were not a part of that. Okay. The trench coat mafia was a group of outcast theater kids who wore long coats. They listened to Korn, and they didn't shoot anyone. Okay. But trench coats looked scary on TV, so that's what stuck. And then we kind of come to Cassie Bernal and this false saint story that was created about her. She was the famous story to come out of Columbine, of course. Cassie Bernal, the girl who said yes when she was asked if she believed in God, except that didn't happen. Multiple survivors have testified that it was actually Valine Schnur who was asked, and she later survived. Cassie was asked, and she never responded because she didn't get a chance to respond. She was shot immediately. So the myth is she said yes. However, the fact is she never had time to say yes. That didn't stop the evangelical, weird Westboro Baptist kind of machine from cranking out books and songs and merch and martyrdom that didn't belong to this one girl who didn't have a chance to respond. They turned a dead girl into a political tool, and that's disgusting, and no one ever corrected it. And now we get to the blame game. We're blaming Doom, we're blaming The Matrix, they blamed goth culture, rock music, edgy jokes, Marilyn Manson. But what they didn't blame were the 99 bombs that they had, or the loophole that let a teenager buy a Tech 9 without a background check. Because that would have meant accountability. And we don't do that here. And something that doesn't get mentioned, but I mentioned all these other things that was just in the news all the time. The SWAT team that was outside, they didn't enter the school until nearly 3 p.m. These students waited in the library. They hid in the library for 3 hours after it had ended. 3 hours after Dylan and Eric had painted the ceiling with their most innermost thoughts. Where was the action? You're armed, you're trained, you're locked, and you're loaded, and you wait. But that also got buried beneath all this other BS, Doom and the books and the merchandise and all that. 3 hours. Teachers were bleeding out. Students were coming to terms with the fact that they were never going to see their parents again. But what's the legacy of Dylan and Eric? Well, on shorthand, they've become memes. Edgelord saints to the worst corners of the internet. But also, for some reason, they've become martyrs to the worst incels online through Tumblr blogs and TikTok and fan fiction, Columbiners, people romanticizing sociopaths because they wore long coats and didn't smile in pictures. You remember the video I did about hybristophiliacs? Yes, hybristophiliacs. That's what we've become. Well, Columbiners have, because they've romanticized these weird incels. You see, the truth was in the journals. Eric had written, "You had your chance and now it's too late." Dylan wrote, "I want to die. I hate my life." And I think if anyone had read these journals, maybe, just maybe, this could have been prevented. Maybe these individuals could have got help, or just something that this could have been avoided. But we'll never know, because it went from being evidence to just being a cautionary tale, a warning to those that has permeated through nearly 30 years. 30 years. It's creeping up on that for Columbine. After Columbine, the internet did what it does with most things. It found the killers and it gave them a following. Fan pages, romantic edits, fan fiction, girls writing love letters to dead murderers. Columbiners turned Dylan and Eric into things that they never were, and that was saints. This is an actual quote from a Tumblr post. "Eric was just misunderstood. He had a beautiful soul." A beautiful soul. He called disabled kids worthless. He wrote about raping and murdering his classmates. But someone decided that he had a beautiful soul on Tumblr. 3 examples of these copycats: the Virginia Tech shooting of 2007, Sung Hong Cho. He left a video manifesto in which he referenced Columbine multiple times. Sandy Hook, 2012, Adam Lanza, obsessed with mass shootings, he studied Columbine in detail. 2018, the Parkland shooting, he wore a shirt that said, "I am better than Eric and Dylan." When I say these things, Columbine was more than a tragedy. It really did create a blueprint for sick incels to map out what they needed to do. Pick a school, pick a target, create a manifesto, dress for it, try to leave your own legacy and be theatric. That's what they've done. And it's continued on. I mean, the reasons why it stuck, because it wasn't just news for people, it was entertainment. It turned into TV specials and novels and podcasts and reenactments and movies based on the events. American Horror Story took a school shooter and tried to make him into a sex symbol with boyish charm. It wasn't the first mass shooting in America, but it was the first one that America marketed. And if you think kids are growing up in this country are watching that, you're lying to yourself. And what do we do after Columbine? We gave kids bulletproof backpacks. We locked doors. We have active shooter drills. And then we gave them nothing else. You teach kindergartners how to play dead before we teach them how to pass a law, or politicians to pass laws. That's the legacy of Columbine. It's not over. I mean, there were warning signs. Years of them. Teachers saw the signs. Friends heard the jokes. Parents saw the weapons. But no one ever thought it would happen. And then it did. It did happen. So, in finality of Columbine, we remember the victims, we mourn the day, but we try to ignore the legacy of these two horrible people, two just stains on society, and because of that, Columbine never really ends. It never really did. It just kind of goes viral. Thank you guys for watching the video. I greatly do appreciate it. This is a little bit different than what I normally do when I'm covering these morbid things, but Columbine is just a different kind of beast, and it kind of pisses me off in a different way, just on how the media handles it. So, um, do me a favor, and I would tell you to like, subscribe. I don't really care if you do that right now. Just remember the victims. Remember the 13 victims of Columbine. Um, and if you ever see anything, say something. See you guys next time.